We have to be making sure that we get the rest of society to buy in, because it is not the women who must change. It is society that must change. We're blaming women for not having done anything. The women are the ones who have tried the hardest, and society has not changed. It's not the women who must change, it's society who has failed women.
Now, society has failed women, and the statistics are there to prove it. Over the last 20 years, female labor participation has dropped 2% globally, and on average, women across the world still earn roughly 23% less than their male counterparts. But when it comes to female representation in politics, 8 of the world's leading nations are in sub-Saharan Africa. And in Rwanda, 64% of parliamentarians are female, the highest level in the world. So just how gender equitable is Africa, and what still needs to be done to better empower women on the continent? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, data from around the world shows that economic growth is higher and poverty rates lower in countries with more gender equality. The AFDB's Gender Equality Index mapped gender equality across 52 African countries. Here are the top 10 countries rated according to their overall performance, with Madagascar bringing up the rear and South Africa leading the pack. Now, on political participation, the index found that Rwanda is the first and only country in the world where more than half of parliamentarians are female. Globally, only 22% of all national parliamentarians were female as of January 2015, a slow increase from 11.3% in 1995. Now, only 10 women served as head of state and 14 served as head of government. South Africa has the highest gender parity rates for wage employment outside agriculture, while Namibia's constitution guarantees equality before the law and the right to non-discrimination on the basis of sex. Now, to increase the productivity of rural women, Malawi has improved women's access to agricultural training, information, input and services. Botswana's Women Economic Empowerment Program provides support to women for arable farming, while Tanzania has one of the highest rates of female labor force participation in Africa. Mauritius has gradually introduced free education at primary, secondary and tertiary levels. These measures have helped literacy rates among girls reach 90%. Tunisia set up a free family planning services to facilitate reproductive health services. Botswana provides 90% of pregnant women with access to HIV testing and counseling services, while Algeria has Africa's highest share of births attended by skilled staff. So, are Africa's women today empowered enough after many years of lobbying for gender equality? And if not, why? Well, in 2010, the United Nations General Assembly created UN Women, the United Nations entity for gender equality and the empowerment of women. Talk Africa sat down with the Executive Director and former South African Deputy President Phumzile Mlambo Nguka to try and establish where Africa lies on the gender equality scale. Thank you very much for your time. Now, I want to start first with the organization UN Women. Now, you're the Executive Director of the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, also known as UN Women. It is a relatively new organization, started in 2011. That's now about 4 years, though. What would you say have been some of the successes of your advocacy?
The biggest success has been to get governments to change legislation in almost every country to address gender equality, and in some cases to amend constitutions, and to also recognize, for instance, domestic violence as a crime, and to then put in place legislation that addresses ending violence against women.
We have the largest cohort ever of educated women, yet globally women are struggling to find work. What are the obstacles, though? Because as you mentioned, there is actually progress in the education of the girl child.
Yeah. While we have the highest number of women graduates in the world that the world has ever seen, that does not translate into women entering into senior management and, for instance, commanding heights of the economy.
Why is that, though?
Stereotypes, prejudice against women and pushback. In some cases, almost hidden biases towards women within private sector institutions. And the fact that we do not have a higher representation of women in decision-making bodies of economic institutions means that we don't always have enough champions to fight for women, notwithstanding that there is now enough evidence to show that gender diverse private sector institutions perform much better than their counterparts. So the issue of stereotype is still a big elephant in the room.
I want to pick up on your comment about globally women being paid 24% less than men, though. How do you hope that this can be rectified? Can it be rectified?
Well, it's a number of measures that are necessary. One, something I call the power of one. CEOs, chairmen of boards, because most of them are men, can actually take a decision and force their companies to correct this anomaly. Governments in countries where there's legislations that recognizes gender equality can actually address that using the legislation that already exists in the countries and have the will to enforce it. It's even worse for mothers, something that the ILO calls the Motherhood Penalty, where for mothers, the data shows that for every child you have, you earn less, and for a father, for every child you have, you are likely to earn more. Now, I don't think that companies sit down and decide that you are going to discriminate against mother, but there's just a prejudice that if you become a mother and you have a child, you are likely to be less productive. Come on. Because, I mean, really, can you tell me that anyone who has a child is automatically underproductive? And that everybody who comes to work and who doesn't give birth is automatically a highly productive person at work? It takes more than that to be a competent worker and productive. And our experience is that women work very hard. And even if they need time to go and facilitate the creation of the next generation by being mothers, they still are able to actually do their work. And for them to be punished by society for that, employers, governments, it actually is quite serious. But maybe this is a debate that society has not had in earnest and actually looked how we actually discriminate sustainably. Because in countries like Germany or Sweden, in the full life cycle of a woman worker who is a professional, they lose about 30% of their wages just because they are a mother.
In terms of government and in terms of political will, are there countries, which countries would you say though that have put in place the right policies to ensure that there is women empowerment? Which countries are doing what you would call better than others?
Yeah. Firstly, I think it's important to say there is no country that has achieved gender equality. So that in its own, I think it's quite telling. But there are countries that we would regard as the most gender-friendly countries. Iceland is at the top of the list. But Iceland has a gender pay gap. Iceland has got a problem of violence against women. Iceland also has a problem of the majority of unpaid care work being done by women. So these are quite substantive issues that are systemic, that create the structures that sustain gender inequality and cause it to recur. And we therefore are saying in different countries, in order to bring about fundamental change, we need to make sure that we address these structural issues within society. Because, I mean, in the last 20 to 40 years, we've all been very busy. We cannot blame countries, institutions for not trying, but probably we've just been doing the wrong things or the things that do not provide irreversible changes. We need, therefore, to go back. We have to say, it's not sustainable that we regard men as breadwinners and women as homemakers, because what that means is that men do work that pays, women do work that doesn't pay. And that comes with a whole lot of baggage which follow the majority of women in the world for the rest of their lives. Just by changing that, we would unleash a large number of women into the formal and informal economy, And we would be able also to contribute to the growth and development of the economies of the world, and we would also be able to enhance economic inclusion. But in order for us to do that, it cannot be business as usual. We have to choose the battles that we're going to fight on behalf of women. Unpaid care work, which has been difficult to define, is a major stumbling block. It has to be recognized, redistributed, remunerated, and reduced so that a larger number of women don't have to be stuck at home.
Now, to give us a better idea of the situation on the ground, I'm joined by two expert guests. Priscilla Nyokabi, she's standing by for us in Nairobi. She's the Nyeri County Women Representative in the Kenya National Assembly, as well as the Deputy Chairperson for Justice and Legal Affairs. In Johannesburg, we're joined by Mbuyiselo Botha. He's the Government and Media Relations Manager at Sonke Gender Justice. To you both, thank you very much for joining us on this discussion. Mr. Botha, I'll start off with you there in Johannesburg and pick off from where the Executive Director of UN Women talked about just a little while ago. She says, though, that we have seen the highest women graduates in decades, but that has not translated into better employment. Where are we, though, in Africa in terms of employment, in terms of the way package, in terms of the education?
Well, I think we're still far behind, and the reasons that, as she says, the Executive Director, and I fully agree, is that we as men remain the gatekeepers. It is us, it is in fact a patriarchy that still holds us back as men and holds women back, but also it holds the economies of the world very, it holds them back as well.
Priscilla, though, you're responsible for, you're the county women representative for Nyeri there. This whole issue of patriarchy, though, is that one of the issues you are confronted with in your day-to-day business?
Every day, not even just in Nyeri, but in the National Assembly as well, where I serve as the Vice Chair and the Chair of Caucus 47, the Women Representatives Caucus. I mean, every day we confront patriarchy, and we're a long way off.
Well, both let me just come back to you, though, on that whole question of quantifying the numbers for us, though. Is there a difference here, so to speak, between the rural woman and the urban woman in Africa?
Well, there's no difference in South Africa here between the rural and the urban. The challenges are the same. The problems are the same. Women remain at the bottom of the ladder. Women remain the most discriminated, most underpaid. So we remain with the largest numbers of women who are still not empowered. Even those that are in higher positions, you'd find that in the urban areas, they're only in positions that are so-called soft positions, not these meaningful, substantive positions like your executive director, like your financial director. You still have women occupying your HR director, meaning that women are expected not only to be nannies at home, but to continue to be nannies even in the workplace.
Why is that, though, Mr. Botha? Because we have seen advocacy over the last 40 years, on women issues. Has it just been mere rhetoric and not much action? Why are women still at the bottom of the ladder?
Well, it has been, to your point, which is very true, it's been rhetoric because there's also a lack of political will. And as I said earlier on, it continues because it's about power, it's about control, it's about us as men continue to feel that these levers of power, they belong to us. It's all about also thinking that we were born to lead. We're born to be in charge of the universe. So all of these things from birth, these are stories that continues to dominate our lives, even in the workplace, even in government throughout the world. We continue to have the same narrative. And what is that narrative? The narrative is that men are in charge, are in control. And unless and until all of us, men in Africa, throughout the world, are able to say, so far and not further.
All right, Priscilla, though you're a member of the Kenya National Assembly, are you finding that there is a lack of political will?
I think the political will is much better now in Kenya with the new constitution, and I agree with the UN director that the law does matter. So we have a new constitution, a new regime which is positive on women, and we are hoping that that political will be exhibited in the 2/3 gender law matter. We are at a critical point in Kenya where we need more women in the National Assembly and in the Senate law so that the next election can have the 2/3 law observed. That's where political will be tested.
All right, we will be looking at that in just a minute because the Executive Director of UN Women will talk about how the law impacts on women issues in just a moment. For now, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll hear more from the UN Women Executive Director about empowering Africa's women. To stay with us.
You can change your societies for the better. You can make protecting and empowering women the priority that it has to be. You can resolve to arrest the men that commit these crimes and prosecute them, to look at your laws and see what needs to be changed, to root out violence and discrimination against women in all forms. You can all make a decision right now in your own minds that you are going to commit to see this change become a reality.
That was actress and UN Special Ambassador for Refugees Angelina Jolie appealing to leaders at the recent African Union Summit to step up efforts to protect women on the continent. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now we're going to get straight back into our discussion as we pick up where we left off with the Executive Director of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo-Nguka. The African Union has made 2015 the year of women empowerment. The African Development Bank, the AFDB, has a gender strategy for 2014 through to 2018. In terms of Africa's position on gender equality, where do you see Africa's position?
Africa has to address access to quality education for girls through secondary school, and we have to make sure that we remove all of the diversions that take girls away from schools, because just by adding 1 year of schooling for a girl is a major benefit for the women's economic empowerment. Africa also has to make sure that we address the issue of traditions and practices that are harmful to women and girls. Many of them surround the girls' rights and reproductive health. We have to make sure that girls are not as exposed to the kind of violence, especially adolescent girls that experience, which right now, for instance, is putting us in a very difficult situation where the only cohort where HIV/AIDS new infections are on the increase is adolescent girl. And it is because older men are actually having relationships with young girls. So African men have to take a stand. It has to be a man who must say, I will not marry a child. I will not be violent towards a woman. I will not have my sister, my child mutilated. When you have men taking that stance, you increase the voices and from the source of people who have authority and power in most of our societies. So that is why my message is to CEOs of companies, is to fathers, it is to heads of states who are predominantly men. They have to, I can't ask more from women. Women have done everything that needs to be done in this struggle. We need to win men over, and there is an increasing number of women who are embracing this agenda. But we need them to have their voices louder, and we need more men to come.
Are you seeing any change, though, in the case of women's access to finances? Because a few years back, it was all about women could not have access to finances unless, you know, your husband or your brother or your father stood up for you as a guarantor.
Well, we still have 124 countries that still have a legislation of one sort or the other that discriminates against women. So that's a huge number of countries. And this kind of discrimination is about women who can't contract without a support of a male guardian. It is countries where women cannot do certain jobs because they are deemed as unfit for women or dangerous. And a lot has to do with ownership of assets. Land ownership is a big issue. So all of those changes are needed. And part of what we are determined to do as UN Women, between now and 2020, we would have covered every country in the world and supporting, encouraging, cajoling them to make sure that they address this situation. Because just by removing all those laws from the statutes, you unleash a large number of women out of poverty. Just in agriculture, if we were to provide the same inputs and support for women as you provide for women, just from developed countries in Africa, you would take out of food insecurity 150 million people. And so we see this as just some fundamental systematic steps that you could actually take. But we do need to make sure that there is a greater buy-in. We need the media to talk about these things and also encourage, monitor, help us to monitor that some changes are taking place.
Well, many governments, though, are now putting in place as well support structures for women in terms of, financial support, setting up funds for supporting women to venture into business and so forth. Is this a way to go, though, in terms of bridging?
It's parts, but also private sector has got to transform itself so that financial inclusion is also a priority for them. They've got to recognize that doing business with women is good business. I think you always hear about private sector talking about how women are good borrowers, they pay back, they don't default, but for some reason there isn't as much enthusiasm when it comes into increasing the number of people they're lending to. So we are encouraging governments to provide opportunity within the state to do business by set-aside procurement of specific goods that women can produce. And we would like to see more governments doing that. I'm not talking about catering. I'm talking about infrastructure, because women can be in building. I've seen that happen. I am talking about technology. And of course, agriculture is very, very important. Women can provide goods and services in the field of agriculture.
All right, Madam Executive Director, thank you very much for your time. It has been a pleasure. Well, that was UN Women Executive Director Phumzile Mlambo-Nguka. I still have my expert guest standing by in Nairobi, Priscilla Nyokabi. She's the Nyeri County Women Representative in the Kenyan Parliament, as well as the Deputy Chairperson for Justice and Legal Affairs. In Johannesburg, Mbuyiselo Bota, he's the Government and Media Relations Manager at Sonke Gender Justice. Priscilla, first to you now. According to a UN Women's report, their female labor participation has dropped 2% globally, and women still earn about 24% less than men. The question, though, is how do you break that gender wage gap?
I think that's a big one in Kenya as well and the rest of Africa. Education is one big way, but policies, equal pay for equal work and equal qualifications, enforcement of what is going on. But most important for me in the workplaces is dealing with sexual harassment. Some of the women who try to go up the ladder then get a lot of sexual harassment, a lot of domestic, not domestic, sort of gender-based abuses. My profession, which is a legal career, it wasn't easy for women to go up. It was easier for women to remain down, but not to be a judge. We saw what happened in Kenya to the Deputy Chief Justice. So that arena of violence and sexual harassment is something that we should deal with in the workplaces so that the women can then ascend and break the glass ceiling.
Well, that is really all about stereotyping of women, that they probably shouldn't break that glass ceiling. So how then do you break that glass ceiling? How do you break that stereotype?
I think many things. One of them is for us to be strong. I don't agree with the UN Women Director that women have done everything they can. I think that as women, we still have a lot of distance to cover. We've come a long way, of course, but we still have a lot of distance to cover in terms of being strong, in terms of occupying spaces, political spaces, and fighting it out with men, because that is what will guarantee us the respect that we deserve.
All right, Mr. Botha, to you in Johannesburg, it's not the women who must change, it's society. Do you agree?
Well, yes, I do agree that it is, I mean, all of us have a role to play in ensuring that we change this society. But I think I like what the executive director was saying about the role that we can play, we must play, we should play as men in ensuring that we change attitudes, we change values, we change the mindset. It is men who remain the gatekeepers. It is men who remain with the levers of power. And until and unless we talk to each other as men and realize that there's something in it for us when women are liberated, because you also get liberated as men.
All right. Priscilla, though, where do you think the biggest stumbling block is? Is it policy, the women themselves, or is it the men?
I think the men, in terms of patriarchy, because even policy changes, you do find that the people sitting on the policy table are largely male. But even as we say that the men should change, I think the men in leadership have a bigger role. We still see men in leadership accused of domestic violence, men in leadership who will not let their daughters inherit their wealth, men in leadership who are not allowing women to scale the heights that they need to scale. I think that the men in leadership in all our countries in Africa have got to take this as a personal calling and as a personal duty, because patriarchy is a very embracing system. And women, remember, we are caught up in this same patriarchy system. In my country here, Kenya, women don't even elect other women. I think that some of these are also myths that we have to fight, and women lead the fight, men lead the fight, because gender equality is for everybody. Gender equality is not just for women, it's actually for both men and women. But I wouldn't avoid calling on the states and heads of states and government. The African Union, you will find that debates on gender issues don't receive as much attention as they need to at that table. I think that the African Union also has a task on this agenda.
All right, as we look at the tasks ahead on the women empowerment front, though, Priscilla, we're looking ahead at what's coming up now, and one of the issues that's coming up is that China and the UN Women will be hosting a global summit on women in September in New York. From your perspective, though, looking at the challenges and looking at what needs to be done, what should they be focusing on? What should we be focusing on moving forward?
I think education still needs tighter attention, because that is where we start losing the battle. I think preferential procurement in terms of government tenders and contracts, I think that also would be a useful policy direction. And gender-based violence, commitment and more funding to fighting and eradicating gender-based violence, including issues like FGM, which continue to then make it impossible for girls to go to school. I think if those issues are addressed at that very high level, that will be useful. And then health is also a big indicator of where women are going. We must be able to deliver peacefully and safely in our homes, in hospitals, sorry, not in homes. I would add water on that line, because we still have huge problems with water in the continent and access to safe drinking water in our homes. I'm hoping that some of us will be able to participate from Nairobi in that global workshop.
All right, Mr. Botha, to you, the same issue?
Well, I wanted to say that as women meet towards the end of the year, it's important that issues of empowerment, issues of real empowerment of women become central, so that, you know, African leaders, men in particular, realize the enormity of the problems that women continue to face. It is women who are at the cold face of poverty, at the cold face of inequality, at the cold face of violence. All of these issues are central, and as men, we should realize that when we invest in women, we invest in the world.
All right, and that's all we have time for this week. Please do join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Priscilla Nyokabi joining us here in Nairobi, and Buyisela Botha joining us from Johannesburg. To you both, thank you very much for being on the program. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.